All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson. I am your host. In this episode, we are going to talk about President Oak's address to BYU in the devotional from last week. Again, this mantra coming from the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles to the youth of the church, to the young adults of the church, to all of the church, and especially to a place like BYU where you have the fountain of these ideologies, and you have the religion of academia, right, sprouting out of there. And so you get these messages that keep coming forward. We're hearing them over and over again. Hopefully some of that is making some changes. There are other changes being made on the back end that are very exciting, and hopefully will actually manifest in some real change moving forward. I think that it already has to a limited degree, but I think there's much more change that is coming. But you're going to see here that there are two of the three major messages that the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are giving us, and especially to the youth, especially to BYU. But we need to look at this as members of the church as really a much broader message, because even though education, right, especially the universities, but also K-12, but especially the universities, this is where these ideologies are sprouting from. This is where the religion of academia comes from, critical social justice, a hard left Marxian anti-racism, all of these, identitarianism, right? These things are coming from the universities. And so this is where the primary addresses are going to. I wish they were a little sooner, but they're here, right? They're here, and the mantra is being carried out. But there are three major messages that are being given by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. They are what I will call President Nelson's identity hierarchy, right? Which is child of God, child of the covenant, disciple of Christ, and then all other identities and labels below that. That's a very important thing to know and to see and to absorb and understand why that's important. We're going into that in another episode here shortly. The second major message is the two great commandments. And so you have the first great commandment of loving God first, and then the second commandment of love your neighbor as yourself, right? Loving others. And they keep going over this because there is a tendency right now through these ideologies, just like with identitarianism, where they're trying to take the other labels and identities and usurp them, right? Usurp the identity of child of God, child of the covenant, disciple of Christ, with these lower identities, less important, and flip the hierarchy. They're doing the same thing with within the church and within Christianity. The same thing is happening with the first and the second commandment. There's a reason why there are two commandments. And it's interesting because the lawyer that asks Jesus, what is the great commandment in the law? He comes back with two. He gives us context to the great commandment. The great commandment, the first great commandment, he says, is to love God first. The second great commandment is to love others, right? That is sequential. It is a hierarchical structure. And the ideologies of academia are flipping that on its head. And so the message that keeps coming out in regard to the first and the second commandment has to do with taking that second commandment, which we usually interpret as tolerance, right? And this kind of love for others and compassion for others over and above the commandments of God and obedience to God is something that the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are trying to set back in place in the church. That is sequential. It is a hierarchical structure. When you flip values like that is the greatest tool the adversary has, because he's taking something good and trying to usurp the greater good. And that ends up, it's like a house of cards, right? Everything's going to fall from there. You can't have the the cornerstone, so to speak, fall apart and have the rest of the building be secure. It just doesn't work. And so that's what you see happening here. It's this flip in hierarchical structure. The third message to BYU, and I think it's a message that should be understood by members of the church as well, is going back to Spencer W. Kimball's 2nd century address to BYU. And they keep referring to this address to BYU as BYU needs to be a unique place. And we can't lose that uniqueness. We can't lose the spirituality, the commandments of God, and allowing the movements, the ideologies, the philosophies of men that are so rampant in academia overtake the gospel principles of Jesus Christ. And of course, that we see this happening at BYU in certain pockets, let's say. And so this is a message again. Don't flip the hierarchy. Don't let these other ideologies usurp the principles of the gospel. All right. So you see these three things. So we're going to cover this address by President Oaks and just go through some of these clips in his address. And you'll see kind of the overall message that he's giving here. Especially for him, it's the talk for Spencer W. Kimball and the 2 great commandments. Last week, the week before, we had Elder Christofferson, and he talked about 2 of the 3 primarily, which were identity, right, from the identity hierarchy, and then secondarily, again, the 2 great commandments. So let's listen here to President Oaks.
In one of the first devotional assemblies in the fall of 1975, President Spencer W. Kimball delivered his inspired 2nd century address. I was then president of Brigham Young University, so I listened to and subsequently pondered his talk as intently as any person living.
Okay, so right away, President Oaks goes into the talk of Spencer W. Kimball, the 2nd century address that he gave in 1975, or it might have been 76. I'm not sure. I think it was 75. But he goes over, he refers to this talk over and over again. And if you go back and you listen to Elder Christofferson, who has spoken twice already in 2022 at BYU, he refers often to the same talk. This is becoming an anchor point for the mission of BYU and the message that is coming out from the brethren right now in regards to the direction that BYU needs to go. Of course, Elder Christofferson in both of his talks also went over the first 2 great commandments as well. But there are a couple things that President Oaks is going to refer to in this talk by President Spencer W. Kimball that are very interesting, that apply directly to what is happening with the religion of academia today.
Thus, President Kimball explained, BYU must not be shackled by worldly ideologies and concepts. It must not allow itself to be made over in the image of the world.
Right, so BYU must not be shackled to the ideologies of the world. Well, why would that be an issue for Spencer W. Kimball in the 70s? Well, of course, we know what was going on in the 60s and the 70s, a massive cultural revolution just like we're going through right now. It was the same type of thing. It was a hard leftist movement sprouting out of education, the time of Marcuse and many others, and other very hard leftist radicals that were coming mostly out of academia. When the Frankfurt School landed in the U.S. in the 1930s, I believe, when they left Germany, they landed in the universities, right? They made this more into a university-driven Marxian movement. Previously, that had not been the case, right? Lenin was not an academic. Gramsci was not an academic. But the Frankfurt School landed at Columbia University and began to spread much of what they were teaching throughout academia at the time. And so this is where it nested and fomented within the universities of the United States. So Spencer W. Kimball is, of course, addressing BYU in regards or in response to what was happening in the 60s and 70s with these ideologies, which were eventually kind of put at bay after a while. They lost to the more mainstream civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s. But they didn't go away. They began to grow in other ways. They eventually moved further into identitarianism with critical race theory and Kimberly Crenshaw and others, until we end up now with Ibram Kendi and D'Angelo and many others. Of course, add postmodernism in there from the French, and you get this, like I talk about, you get this hydra in the universities that is critical social justice as a whole. That's the body, and then you have all of these heads that are all of these different disciplines, these different departments within a university. That's where these things come from. So that's where you get postmodernism. That is where you get critical race theory. That is where you end up with gender theory and queer theory and radical feminism and colonialism and whiteness studies. These are all the heads of the same body, the same hydra that is built, originally birthed through the DNA of Kant, Hegel, Marx and Engels, and then coming into the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, and then all the others that we have now today. That's what critical social justice is. That's what these ideologies are rooted in. And they reside in the universities, which now today produce the culture in the United States. It is no longer Hollywood. It is no longer the news media. It is no longer even technology, really, that I would say, not primarily, that generate the culture in the United States. It is academia. It is the philosophies of men that are sprouting out of academia. And President Kimball, reiterated here by President Oaks, goes over this specifically.
President Kimball explained, BYU must continue to resist false fashions in education, staying with those basic principles which have proved right and have guided good men and women and good universities over the centuries. End of quote.
Okay, so these fashions, right, that come through. Again, these are the fashions that were going through academia in the 60s and 70s when Spencer W. Kimball made his second century address. And they are back with a vengeance, with different messaging. It's the same hydra, but it is different messaging with a lot more heads that are on the hydra now, with a primary focus now being on identitarianism. So the message from the brethren here is we've got to be willing, when necessary, to break away from the rest of academia. Now, that's a hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to do when you bring in professors, your faculty coming in from other institutions, which is what you want to do, right? You want great scholarship. You want your cake and eat it too, basically. You want great scholarship. You want scholars that are very, very well trained, that are mentored by the best in academia. And then but they're also taught underneath these primarily postmodern and critical theory narratives and filters to look at their different disciplines through those filters, through those lenses. And you're starting to see that more and more in the church and at BYU, even in LDS scholarship. So even on Latter-day Saint scripture, literary critique is a very popular thing in academia right now. And so those things that come from critical theory and from postmodernism are now being applied to our sacred texts. And for them, it's an academic exercise. That's all it is. It's like, yeah, this is what I'm trained to do. This is fascinating. This is interesting. And look, all the rest of my colleagues love this. And there can be some interesting things that come out of that. But overall, it is not it's not a positive thing. And you're going to see this get worse and worse with academia and the scriptures, where identitarianism is going to be played in on, is going to be used on the scriptures. So whether it's misogyny, whether it's toxic masculinity, whether it's radical feminism or racism, you might even be looking at a lot of gender theory and queer theory that's going on in there. We had last year I did an episode on a BYU professor that was using we were talking about Joseph of Egypt being gay. Perhaps he was gay. You're going to get a lot of those things because that's how it's done. That's what you do. That's what's popular. Those are the fashions with these philosophies and ideologies in academia right now. So as a professor at BYU, as an administrator, even though you are tied in through your network and through your peers at other universities and some of your peers at BYU, and your newsletters and your email threads and your social media and the books you read and the published papers that you read, and you're tied in so far to this. How do you break away from those things? Right? How do you put the hierarchical structure in place that is necessary to be at a place like BYU and keep the first commandment first? And keep BYU as a unique place and not take identitarianism coming out of academia and put it above President Nelson's identity hierarchy. Sometimes you've got to break away from the rest of academia. That's not easy.
President Kimball also spoke about our relationship with other universities. We can sometimes make concord with others, including scholars who have parallel purposes. In other instances, we must be willing to break with the educational establishment, not foolishly or cavalierly, but thoughtfully and for good reason, in order to find gospel ways to help mankind. Gospel methodology, concepts, and insights can help us to do what the world cannot do in its own frame of reference.
Great comment. Of course, who am I to tell him it's a great comment, right? But again, the gospel, rely on it, use it, right? If you're a professor at BYU, if you are, I know this is a very difficult thing to navigate. I get it. I get it. But God, there's so much power and wonder in being able to have the gospel in your life and those truths and have them, overshadow everything else because they're rooted in truth and not in the philosophies of men. What a great opportunity to make things Christ-centered and to put all of the secular information that we want under the housing of a Christ-centered, gospel-centered teaching. Unfortunately, there are those at BYU that don't want to do this. There's so much more in this talk, and of course I'm going to put this as a link in the description of the YouTube episode here. But he goes over the breaking away from not only from all other education when necessary, but also from the government, where government kind of comes in with its tentacles at times. Like with Title IX, he gives the example of Title IX in 1974, where President Oaks played a very integral part, along with other church leaders, in changing the way that Title IX worked in the institutions, the educational institutions. Because without the changes they made today, BYU would have a difficult time existing, right? Because there would not be, for example, probably the ability to have separate housing for men and for women. And a lot of those that might listen to this think, what's the big deal? Well, again, we have certain values that we would fight for. And there are other things as far as teaching and curriculum that would not be allowed if Title IX were this much larger. It actually was a very big victory for the church and for other religious institutions to keep Title IX at bay. An interesting thing to bring up if you're going to talk to someone, especially at BYU or in education anywhere, but if BYU is talk about Title IX and of course within context, because there's some very good things about Title IX, but if you bring up Title IX and you talk about BYU's unique mission, you can figure somebody else's agenda out pretty quickly by asking them what they think about Title IX versus BYU, because there are conflicts there. And President Oaks is making a very clear statement here about keeping things like Title IX at bay. Now, I love what he does here in bringing up Elder Holland's talk last year. Remember the muskets talk that those who are against the mission of BYU, honestly, and are very much for identitarianism, used as a club, so to speak, to beat the church over the head, to beat the brethren over the head. You had some prominent academics or those studying that actually called Elder Holland satanic because of his talk. And you had a lot of BYU scholars and other Mormon studies scholars and though other LDS scholars outside of BYU massively support what this guy said about Elder Holland being satanic and the church being run by just a bunch of old white men. So I love that President Oaks comes right back here in this talk and refers to Elder Holland's speech from last year.
Elder Holland emphasized this challenge in his inspired address to the faculty and leaders last year.
So I love that he brings that up in his inspired talk, right? So if you had a problem, and you know who you are, because I know there are many at BYU that had a major problem with Elder Holland's talk last year, and it was very obvious from the feedback there that I heard that nothing would change after his talk, and it didn't. Here's President Oaks supporting him and his talk and calling it inspired. And he brings up here, as you can see here from Jeffrey R. Holland, he brings up here again President Kimball's talk. Elder Holland last year in that talk, in that inspired talk, also brought up President Kimball's second century address. This is a very intricate part of what the brethren want with BYU. I'm going to put President Kimball's talk a link to that talk also in the YouTube description. Now, lastly, I want to go again to the two great commandments. This is one of the three major messages. This is just me speaking, right? This is what I infer from all of this. I see these three major messages. But again, these are the things that are repeated over and over again. And here President Oaks is going to again talk about the two great commandments. A reminder, President or Elder Christofferson, having spoken twice already at BYU, went over this in both of his addresses to BYU this year. The first of the two, I believe his talk actually was called something along the lines of the first two great commandments. Let's listen to what President Oaks says about this.
If tempted to take such a vacation, you should remember that this soon leads to forgetting gospel truths like the first commandment to love God. And it also leads to forgetting gospel covenants.
Okay, so that's the first time he brings up the first commandment, in that possibly losing your understanding and covenant in putting God first. And then he's going to go back to it again.
We must not forget the Savior's teaching that the first and great commandment in the law is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. And the second commandment is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The love of neighbor, however important, does not come ahead of love of God and obedience to his commandments. If we truly love God and serve him as he has taught us, we will love our neighbor as God loves him or her, and as he would have us love and serve them.
Okay, so there it is again, right? And this is just, it's part of the mantra. It's part of the three messages that are being given out to the youth, to the young adults, and to education at BYU. And it's important, but again, since the culture is sprouting out, or I should say spewing out of academia and the universities in the United States, I think we should understand that this is a message for each one of us, because those are things that are going to strongly affect us and our thinking and our environment around us, because culture is coming from the universities. And so these messages of identitarianism and President Nelson's hierarchy or identity hierarchy are crucial to all of us. And the message of the first two great commandments and keeping those straight, right? Tolerance and allyship even, which is great. Put your arm around others. I'm not saying don't do that. But you can't put it above the love for God. There's nuance here, right? There is, as President Oaks has said in the past, you got to have clear thinking. You have to be able to parse these things out. You want love for everyone. You want charity for everyone. It is a very good thing, but you don't do it at the expense of love for God. That's a problem. And that is a very obvious trend that we are seeing within religion, within Christianity, within the church. And you can see the brethren are trying to put forward a message that we can understand, where we can try and put things straight. I think it'll be very interesting to see if they reiterate this more in General Conference coming up in a couple of weeks. I don't know that they are going to keep it just as to the youth and young adults and education here, or if they're going to start focusing on this more broadly with the church. I hope they do, but we ought to look for that in General Conference. Thanks for your time.